Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Mike Steckline, partner with the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. I'm putting together a PowerPoint today that is an offshoot of a presentation that I did for a group in the Twin Cities. And I wanted to use it as sort of a reflection of some things that I've been thinking about and learning about this past year. And I'm interested in input from everyone that participates in today's webinar on your perspective. So two key topics I wanted to talk about and how I see some connections. One is a systems by design approach that we advise organizations when they want to design better systems, and how it connects to, at least in my mind, a sense-making model that is described by Dave Snowden and the folks at Cognitive Edge. And so it's just basically my reflections on that and how I see some connections. So I'm going to go through some PowerPoint slides and a little housekeeping. I'll keep the phones muted for now. We don't have a large group today, but I do want to pause and see if there's any questions as we go. You can always use the chat function to type some questions. We're recording this session for your use or for the use by others that weren't able to participate today. So some information that I've shared with some groups, and much of this will be familiar to the folks on the webinar. It may be unfamiliar to other folks, but it's a context setting discussion that I've been using, and I used it recently with the folks at an organization in the Twin Cities, and setting the context for adjusting systems. And when we talk about how we're trying to help, and when I say we, my partners at the Institute for Enterprise Excellence and myself, we know that every organization wants to try to achieve results, whether it's quality, cost, delivery, satisfaction, those sorts of high-level results. Nearly everyone is interested in getting some better results from what they're doing. It isn't uncommon for people to learn about tools and methods. And when we think about tools, we think about technical elements. It could be something you learned in a book, get at a conference, you see people trying different methods, say for problem solving. You have meetings, huddles, those are all technical elements, people using whiteboards, using visual management. So it's a categorization of some methods that people will use to try to get results. And the good thing is many times those do achieve results, and just plotting it on the graph on the right-hand side of this slide, that's a good news. And tools are a part of improvement efforts that do work. Sometimes the reason we get those improvement of results may not necessarily be because of the tool, but because we're paying attention to something. And this is reflections on the Hawthorne experiments from Cicero, Illinois in the early 1900s. If you're not familiar with this, in the factory, they wondered what happened if they turned up the lighting in the factory, what would happen to productivity. And they did it, and productivity improved. And they took it one step further, and they said, I wonder what happens when we turn the lighting down. And interestingly, productivity improved. It wasn't a matter of whether the lighting was up or the lighting was down. It was a matter of they were paying attention to something. They were watching what was happening. And so it's often called the Hawthorne effect. And sometimes that could be the reason why you're getting those results. It isn't uncommon also for people to take the enthusiasm from the results they're getting from the use of tools and the desire to spread that or expand it into other areas or push it into existing systems or existing areas. Interesting thing happens many times. The improvement starts to go down, and there's pushback from people that weren't involved with the initial use of the tools. And we wonder why people aren't interested in the use of these tools and why we can't just merely spread from one area to another. And when we think about that, when I think about that, I realize that there's people in those systems, and they've been doing things their own way for quite a while. And it's not going to be just as easy to encourage them or to require them to do something different unless they can understand the reasoning behind that. And many organizations will follow this pathway of a continuous search for more tools or methods. And you see this curve that occurs over time. We can give these different attempts labels going back in time. You could put TQM, CQI, Six Sigma, Lean. We see a number of different improvement initiatives that people are attempting, and it's a common phenomenon. In our group, we call it the comfort of the comfort zone. Other folks have identified it as the flavor of the month. I like the terminology from Dave Snowden, and I mentioned him earlier from the Cognitive Edge Company. He calls it the next new wonderful thing we must all follow. And so it's a common phenomenon. And what we encourage organizations to do is to realize that there's more to continual improvement than repeating that pathway. And we encourage them to switch directions, to turn clockwise in their efforts. And as we used to unpack this model that we call our sustainability model, we used to immediately jump to an understanding of the different principles that are behind the systems and behind the tools. But we realized is that's a pretty big leap for people. It can sound very theoretical. It can sound like going back to school, pretty academic. And we also realized that until you can reconnect people to the purpose of what they're doing, why they're doing it, what they're trying to accomplish in their organization, connect their individual purpose with the organization's purpose, that's a key part of the model as well, and it's an important discussion to have. Then you can begin talking about different principles that are at play and the behaviors that come from an understanding of those principles, and how that will then inform you as you're going to think about different systems you're going to design. And then you're going to pull the tools that you need versus pushing tools onto people. And you'll realize that when you understand the power of systems, systems are going to drive behaviors. And we see this all the time. Anybody that watches people in a area go to the airport, and what do you see people doing? You see people fiddling with their iPhones. They're fiddling with their computers. We didn't always see that. And systems are driving different behaviors. People needing to check their email or check their Twitter or checking their, something on their phone to do that. So we're seeing different behaviors, and those behaviors are coming from different systems that are driving those behaviors. Just a simple example. And when we think about this in organizations and we start understanding, looking for the behaviors that are the most important, we'll realize that there are some upstream, call them leading indicators, the behaviors you see every day, that will lead to the key performance indicators that you want to see over time, the lagging indicators. So it's an important relationship to understand, to realize that what you can pay attention to do today, what you can adjust today, will affect the performance measures you want to see tomorrow. So there's some important relationships there, which gets you into a different sort of an improvement curve that looks like a continuous improvement journey. It isn't always linear. There are some waves, some ups and downs, but it is fundamentally different than the flavor of the month sort of a curve. And so what we try to do in our group is help people to connect to the ultimate purpose through processes, and helping people connect to that as well. And just as a summary, we call this our sustainability model. The latest version of a white paper that describes this model can be found at this bit.ly link here. So I know for many people on the webinar, this is a review. Sometimes a little repetition is okay. When I did this for the group in Minneapolis, I used this as a point to say one reason that I wanted to focus on this for the conversation as a context was I wanted to talk about the power of this part of the model called understanding systems, and what that means as far as understanding systems and the power that they drive. We use this framework to talk about, just to summarize, there's two different ways that you can go about this improvement journey. I think it's a misnomer to say that some people believe that they're going to avoid the pitfall of the tool-based approach, and we've not seen that. Nearly every organization that we've seen does start with learning tools and applying tools, and it's not wrong. It's just not a complete picture of a continuous improvement journey. So we encourage people to think about that different pathway, going clockwise. We call it a principle-based approach, but it isn't uncommon for people, nearly everyone, to start with a tool-based approach until they realize that there's more to it and they need to understand the principles behind the systems and behind the tools. We talk about what do we mean by principles. We use these descriptors to help distinguish what principles are. Often we'll use this to distinguish principles from values. And we have a discussion about what's the difference between values and principles. We'll use the example of science principles like gravity as an example of a principle that it affects everyone. It's universal. It's objective. It doesn't care whether you believe it or not. When we understand it, we benefit from the consequences of understanding it. When we don't understand it or don't follow it, we suffer from the consequences of not understanding that. And we don't have to test the principle. We don't have to test gravity every day. We can know that it's going to be in place, and we can predict that by understanding that principle, we're going to realize the kind of consequences, positive or negative, accordingly. We call this principles for enterprise excellence because not understanding these principles will eventually put you out of business. And some of those are going to be what we might call fast bleeds, and some are going to be slower bleeds. But that's what we mean by understanding these principles. And they may not be principles that people have learned either at work or in their education, and they may be quite different than what principles people are used to. We think about these principles in three domains: principles that help to align people in an organization, principles that help to enable people to improve the work, and principles that help to improve the work. And most of the organizations, when we step in and people have been attempting improvement, we'll talk about this, and it is common that people will be familiar with the principles in the lower right-hand corner, and that's because there's lots of books and workshops on the application of those principles, but less familiar with the other two domains, and not a strong understanding of even application of all three domains in trying to make improvement. There's a lot more I could say about that. We call this the velocity model, but I put this in the context, again, thinking about systems and thinking about the principle of thinking systemically is something that where I want to lead this conversation, particularly as we get into the Cynefin model and how I'm currently thinking about that as it connects to the principles. So just for review, we have some beginning definitions of what these principles mean, again, highlighting under the align category, what does it mean to think systemically, and how is that different than we currently think? And here's some definitions for the other principles that probably everyone is familiar with. You can get, again, information about this from our white papers, but again, I'm just putting it into context here as far as understanding those principles. Another important concept that we want to highlight for folks is this idea of ownership within the sustainability model. So as people learn about this and start thinking about it, they realize that there are at least three main categories of roles within an organization. There's leaders, there's managers, their front line are often categories that we'll use. We realize there could be other layers within an organization. Those are general categories. And the correct ownership of the parts of this model is important. And it's not something that always is attended to. And we have come to believe, and we advise people, that if you have leaders in an organization, their primary responsibility is going to be understanding and demonstrating ideal behaviors that follow from those guiding principles. We use the 80-20 there as sort of a guideline to recognize that there are some systems that leaders own, like strategy deployment, communication, recognition. Those are leadership-owned systems. But and there are some tools that they may use. They may use X matrices. They may even use A3 problem solving. So it doesn't mean that they don't participate in systems and that they don't participate in tools. But if there's one group that really needs to understand and model the use of the guiding principles, it needs to be that leadership group. Managers, the people that report to the leaders, the people that are every day are trying to oversee the daily improvement in management systems, they need to get familiar with and understand the power of systems and understand what does it mean to have a system. They will certainly need to understand the principles if they're going to design better systems, and they'll certainly have tools. Again, the 80-20 rule applies. And the people at the front line, they're the ones that need to own the tools. It needs to be their whiteboard, that has to be their tools, their huddle, their forms, whatever they're using, and they need to be owning them. They have to have the ability to improve them, to change them, and that ownership needs to be something that makes sense to them. And again, we don't often see that in organizations, and a big part of what has to occur is role realignment to try to get people playing the correct roles in the organization. If you have an improvement team or an internal advising support team, you'll notice that their title or their roles are not represented on this diagram. And we consider them to be the transformational architects. It's their roles to try to help people play the correct role. And so they'll have to be familiar with all of this and encourage people to be playing the correct roles. So when we talk about systems, we'll often use this approach. People are familiar with this, looking at the inputs, process, and output, and putting suppliers at the front of that and customers at the end of that, and thinking about what are the outputs that you get from a system, what does it mean to distinguish a process from a system, and realizing that every process may have sub-processes or procedures within it, and then thinking about the inputs. And it's a common discussion that we'll have with people understanding. So let's get clear on what do we mean by a system, and we'll use some guidance such as this, a system has some structure, it has goals and objectivity, it has interconnectivity. I like Dr. Deming's definition of a system, a network of interdependent components that work together toward a common aim. And the Cynefin model we'll be talking about later is, I think, a way to stretch our thinking about what does it mean to think about a system. And it's something I've been pondering as I've been using this terminology. I think it's good beginning terminology for people to use to think about it, but I think there's more to understanding systems and complexity of systems that we need to further understand as we continue this improvement journey going forward. A common framework or visual that we'll use as we talk about systems within an organization. This is something that we'll use often to talk about, let's say that this represents an entire management system within an organization. And it's represented this way to show in the ideal world, where would people be spending most of their time? Where do leaders need to be spending their primary time? Where do managers need to be spending their primary time? What's the appropriate focus and role for frontline staff, those that are closest to the customer, either internal or external customers? And it's representing two fundamental subsystems. The strategic systems, which means preparing the organization for the future, that has to do with developing and then testing and then deploying strategies. That's the upper left-hand triangle. The lower triangle represents a system, a daily improvement system. We call it managing for daily improvement system, that needs to be operating every day to not just deliver to the customers, but trying to align the work that everyone is doing, enabling everyone to do the work and to improve the work. And we have some separate slides that we talk about that. And there's a band in the middle You can think about this, that everyone has some level of standard work or their routine systems that they do. And we use this for discussions when we talk about what do we mean by leader standard work, manager standard work, the standard work that the front line is involved in, and how they're continually thinking about that. I'm going to have a bit to say about standard work as we get into the Cynefin model a little bit later, because I think it's been very beneficial to think about what needs to be standardized and what things can't be standardized, and how we have to think about that. We know that in most organizations, this line is not so evenly divided 50-50, that in many organizations, it's usually a slice that occurs in the upper left-hand corner where leaders desire to spend most of their time doing strategy, thinking, and developing and deploying and testing strategy. In reality, they get pulled into the day-to-day problem solving and firefighting. And it's a constant struggle to try to move that to more of an evenly balanced 50-50 view. I mentioned the lower right-hand corner, managing for daily improvement, and it's common that we'll have conversations with folks about, so what does that look like? I was with a group yesterday at a company. We were using an example of a production manager, and used his area as an example, and talked about what he does every day. And the people that are doing the work, they're building medical components. So that's their work system, which is in the middle. And what he tries to do is have a system that helps to align that work to what the organization is doing. So status boards, visual boards could be a part of that strategy alignment system. What is it that we do in this area that contributes to the goals of the organization? How are we performing on those? Are we on track, off track? And he maintains that, and he uses that in conversations with the team, which might occur in a huddle. So he'll have a communication system to talk about the performance. People will have ideas about what can we do if we're off track, what can we do to adjust today. And they'll have an idea sharing system that often starts as idea sharing. It evolves into problem solving, getting into root causes behind the problems. And then there'll be some sort of system devoted to regular problem solving for the systems, work systems that need to occur. Sometimes they'll decide that something needs to be standardized and stabilized, and so they'll have some sort of a standardization system. And again, I'll give a preview for what I'm going to be sharing a little bit with the Cynefin model, and realizing that not everything needs to be standardized and stable, and well, certainly stabilized is important, but this idea of standard work in which things can be moved into standard work is an important consideration that I'm thinking a lot about these days. So that information I just shared is foundation background information about sort of a general overview that I'll commonly share with folks, just so we're clear about what we're talking about, a principle-based approach. As organizations move into this and they start to realize the power of designing and adjusting systems, it isn't uncommon for us to introduce an approach that we found to be beneficial. And it's listed, or it's unpackaged in a white paper that you can see the bit.ly link below. But we describe an approach to thinking about systems in two basic chunks. One is working on the system, and one is working in the system. And we use the metaphor of putting together a puzzle to help explain what this is about. So think about this. If you have a puzzle, this is actually a picture of a puzzle we're putting together on our dining room table. So step one, and this is all activity around working on the system, step one is to get clear on what that puzzle is going to look like. So prop the lid up on the table and focus on that and say, that's what we're after. That's what we're trying to improve. So get clear on purpose is step one. And then you need to identify where are those corner pieces first, and then where is the edges. And this again helps to frame what system are we talking about. It's very easy to try to tackle a system that is too big. It's important to try to scope what you're working on. So you identify the corners and the edges. And in the terminology we use, we talk about, so if you're clear on the purpose, what behaviors do you want to see the system drive? And then what are the high-level outcomes that you're going to get because you have this system? And again, that's all part of working on the system. After you've gotten clear about that, then you can get into the middle part of the system, which is all of those pieces and working in the system. And this is where you involve the people that actually work on the system every day. And this is the experimentation part. You're trying to experiment with different things that you think are going to get you those behaviors, get you those outcomes, and achieve the purpose of the system. So it's a common metaphor that we'll use. When we share this with folks, and typically it's in a workshop setting, we'll talk about the steps of working on the system, working in the system. We'll use this approach here, a visual, to describe this. We'll reconnect people to the inputs, process, output, and show that it's not a new thing. It's just a different way of looking at what we've already talked about. We're trying to achieve some outputs. There's a process and there's some inputs that we're going to be thinking about related to this approach. And we unpack this, and typically, as I said, it's in a workshop setting where people are trying to get their heads around a system that they want to experiment with. And I encourage people to start with simple systems. I'll be talking about that a little bit later as far as identifying simple systems to experiment with. A common thing that I'm finding to need to reiterate, I'll go back to this slide and just remind people that there are two approaches, two fundamental approaches. There's the left-hand side, which many people will be familiar with. Another terminology we've heard it used, I think this came from Mark Graben, talking about lean in name only, or lino, using the first four letters in the word linoleum, so people just merely rolling it out. And it's a very sort of a surface level approach to improvement. The one we are talking about and the approach that we use, and where this methodology or this approach fits right over here as far as to helping people to connect purpose, principles, and systems, and then understanding experimentation around the systems. But it isn't uncommon for people to see the approach that we're sharing. They'll see it as a tool. And I want to always be clear to folks, we must not see this approach that we teach as a tool that you're now going to push into other people and force them to follow the steps that we outline. That's not what it's about. It's not a tool. It's not intended to be a tool. It's an approach to think about how do you design and adjust a system. When we do this in a workshop setting, it's a activity, and ideally it's an activity in an organization where people are wanting to experiment with real life systems, and we want to build in some time for people to experiment and actually go to the workplace, go to the Gemba, and have discussions with folks about the things that they're talking about in the conference room. And that's an important part of the activity. But we recommend people select a simple system they want to practice on. So how we do communication within our huddle, not communication for the whole organization, but communication within our area is often something. How we do standard work, how we create and how we update standard work is another common one. Coaching system is often something that people will want to tackle. We've seen some good attempts at this. Sometimes coaching is a part of leader standard work, so that's where it shows up there. How a department does strategy alignment is a common system that people will experiment with. How people do problem solving, whether it starts with idea sharing, or how they do the visual management around identifying problems or problem solving. And a common one that I'm encouraging people to experiment with is around leader standard work. Whether you're at a executive leadership position or a management position, thinking about your personal management routine as in an experiment zone. What you want to try to avoid is your first attempt being to try to improve a work system, because that can be a very large puzzle to tackle. And it's important to start simple and then pick a simple system to experiment with that we want to encourage. Another thing we'll often highlight is that there is no instant pudding to this approach. Systems tend to evolve over time, and it's happening all the time, regardless of our efforts to try to help it. The natural way that these systems do and have evolved. We have systems all over our organizations already. They typically start as some target experimentation. Let's try some things and see how it works. Let's continue to nurture those, and we start to see that they start to evolve. They start to form connections, and you can see that some are going to help us to align, some are going to help us to enable, some are going to help us to improve. And then you start to see how those systems start connecting with each other. So for instance, we have strategy alignment systems that we see strong connections to communication, to recognition, to idea sharing, to problem solving, to standardization, to training and development. And you can just see how those connections begin to be really strong. And then it starts to show up from an organization standpoint as it expands. It isn't just occurring in one area, it's occurring throughout the organization. And we encourage people, when they're thinking about doing this, to think about gardening as opposed to being a mechanic. This isn't something that's going to be conducted through a Gantt chart or some project management approach that is going to have rigid timelines. You have to experiment, see what works, and then adjust accordingly, which I'm going to be getting into with what we're learning about the Cynefin Sense-Making Framework. I also encourage people to think about this method as some scaffolding that we talk about the parts of working on the system, working in the system. We have a number of steps. And I encourage people to think about what we're learning here is a framework to think about how do we help to encourage the evolution of systems. And we don't want to fall in love with the method. We don't want to fall in love with that scaffolding. The scaffolding, just like the scaffolding on a building, that's going to be removed. That's going to disappear. And what you're really trying to build is the systems that are underneath that scaffolding. And so our method is intended to help to guide the experimentation to try to help you have better systems for those purposes. So I've talked already about what I've been learning about the Cynefin Sense-Making Framework, and I want to connect some of the things that I've shared so far with some of the things I've been learning with that framework. I've done a couple webinars already on this, so this is a further attempt to try to integrate some of the things I've been thinking about and learning about. So, as I mentioned, this comes from Dave Snowden and others at the Cognitive Edge. I've got a slide later that furthers some recommended resource and study for people to engage in that. But to think about, there are some systems, some situations that tend to be more ordered. So we'll put them on a continuum here on the right-hand side. And then there are some situations, some systems that are unordered. And the distinction that this sense-making framework helps to make sense with is, given the kind of system or situation I find myself in, that I'm going to take different actions. So there's 5 domains, so it's not a quadrant because there is an area in the middle. So there's 5 domains, and the domain that I'm going to start with is to talk about this domain, where you're going to find systems or situations where it's obvious and everyone can agree about what the course of action is. There is a relationship between cause and effect. If we do this, we'll get that. Examples are that you have recipes, there are checklists, you follow procedures, you develop and use standard work. A very simple example of this that's often used is which side of the road do you drive on? You find yourself in our country, United States, everyone agrees we're going to drive on the right-hand side of the road. If you're in another country, the agreement is we're going to drive on the left-hand side of the road. But you get used to and you decide, you understand that's the best practice in this situation where we're at. So you sense what's going on, you categorize, and then you respond. So there are some systems that lend themselves to this nicely, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Still on the right-hand side, but moving to the upper domain, we have situations or systems that are complicated, where to understand what the correct action is going to require some expertise. It's going to require some analysis. There is a relationship between cause and effect, but it's not yet self-evident. So figuring things out, getting some data, doing the analysis is important. And if you have different experts, they may not agree. So this is not best practice. This is where good practice comes to play. Here's some examples where it might be pertinent. People in medicine, studying medicine, law, engineering, situations where there's many moving parts. Information technology may be one of these. There's a lot of different moving parts, how they fit together. Putting together the effort to have a moonshot to send people to and from the moon. Many moving parts. It's complicated. A car is a complicated system. Many different parts. They all fit together. Someone with knowledge to put that car together could do it. It's the parts. It's a sum of the parts, which is kind of different than what we're going to be talking about shortly, which is a complex system with the next domain. So when you see yourself in this situation, the correct action is you're going to sense what's going on, you analyze, and then you respond. So in the more on the unordered side, thinking about complex systems and understanding complexity, understanding complex adaptive system, and contrast this with what I mentioned as far as complicated. You have many parts, and each of those parts are affecting each other, and the system is more than the sum of those parts. An example, I used the example of a car as a complicated system. A complex system is a bunny rabbit. You take a bunny rabbit apart, it's no longer a bunny rabbit, and it's no longer alive, and it's not going to do any interacting. So cause and effect with these sorts of systems is only evident with some hindsight, when we start to see some patterns and understand, oh, that's what was causing that. But we don't know when we're in a complex system what the cause and effects are. We may not even know all of the players or agents that are at play. And the best we can do is try to understand emergent practice, which things are going to work within a complex system. Anytime you have people that are interacting with each other, you're usually dealing with a complex system. Strategic systems, when you're trying to figure out what what might work, what should we do next, those are complex systems. The appropriate action with a complex system is you want to probe first. You want to put some sort of a idea in motion, and then see what happens, and then respond accordingly. Dave Snowden will often use the example of hosting a birthday party for children, and you don't have a rigid project plan. You don't start the party off with a PowerPoint presentation to get the kids to understand, what the goal of the party is. You don't treat it like something you would treat from an MBA course. You put some probes out there, and you want to see what catalyzes. You want to see how, if you put say a video game or a party game or a video or a football or some sort of activity, you want to put something out and see what the response is. And there's going to be some pattern that occurs, and that's called an attractor, and that will perpetuate with the behavior of the other kids. If it's a behavior you like, you're going to amplify it. If it's a behavior you don't like, you're going to dampen it. So you're going to respond accordingly to what happened. So if you find yourself in this zone, you need to think about what sort of safe to fail experiments can we conduct using many experiments, and then be prepared to amplify or dampen accordingly to what happens. Now, the fourth domain is a chaotic domain. This is where there is no cause and effect. Things are just happening. You can enter it accidentally, and if you find that situation, you need to stabilize first. You can enter it deliberately, which will help to lead to innovation when you want to break up the thinking and try to create something fundamentally different. So in this situation, you need to act, then you sense, and then you respond. A common example is what was happening after the 9/11 attack in 2001. Somebody had to take action and say, okay, first we're going to do this, then we sense how that went, and then we respond accordingly. And this is where novel practice occurs, practice that we don't know what's going to work. So taking some action is better than any action. The barrier or the border between the obvious and chaotic, you notice there's a little hook down here in the bottom part. I'm going to talk a bit about that. But that represents that the division between obvious and chaotic is like a cliff. It's like a sharp cliff that it's easy to fall off from obvious into chaotic. And we need to understand and avoid those situations when we're trying to improve things and we treat something as if it's obvious and simple. We tend to overly constrain it. People develop workarounds to what's going on, and chaos will ensue. So I want to talk a little bit about some dynamics that occur around the Cynefin model. So this is kind of like a slide as a summary of the domains. I didn't mention the fifth domain in the middle. It's disordered. That's often where you're at because you don't know what kind of system or kind of situation you're coping with. And so it's a zone where you're trying to figure out, what am I dealing with? What's going on? So I've mentioned multiple safe-to-fail experiments. If you think that you might be in a complex sort of a situation, coming up with some ideas that you would like to test, something safe to fail, something you could do quickly, parallel, using not in a serial manner, but multiple different ideas you'd like to test. What you would like to do is see which of those seem to be the ones that are going to work well, what could be moved over into the complicated domain if they can be stabilized, which means moving through a zone. And this is some work that Dave Snowden and others have been doing within the last couple of years, recognizing that there's zones, he calls them a liminal zone, between the complex and the complicated, where after you've done some safe-to-fail experiments, you've picked some that you want to try to stabilize and build. You can move some over to the complicated domain, where you can better understand cause and effect. And there might even be some that you've decided these are going to be moved into a permanent way that we're going to do this from now on. And you can move it to the obvious domain. Notice that arrow points over to the right. We don't want it to go over to the left, which leads to complacency. And one of the things to know about the Cynefin model is people will tend to act based on the domain that they're most comfortable with. So if people see the answer to everything as being standard work or more bureaucracy, they may overly constrain the system, which inevitably will lead to people developing their own logical ways of doing things, and chaos will ensue. So you want to avoid that. I think that there's another dynamic that occurs in organizations. We know that many times standard work is something that's going to work for a while, but someone will come up with a better way or a new idea, or the context changes. And so I think there is a dynamic that occurs. This may be where continuous improvement, using problem solving, whatever methodology you use, there is a dynamic occurs there. There is a dynamic when you want to break up the thinking becomes entrained with experts, that they get used to their way of thinking, and you want to break up that thinking. You can take a shallow dive into the chaotic zone to try to break up that thinking and try to innovate and create something fundamentally different. A common dynamic that is occurring more and more as the rate of change in the world and the organization is allowing less time for stabilization and standardization, this dynamic of continuous experimentation, moving things over to some complicated zone to get a handle on it, moving things into a shallow dive into chaos to innovate. And that is a common dynamic that I think leaders and organizations are going to have to get used to, because I think it is representing the kind of things that we are dealing with. What I want to do is connect that thinking with what I shared previously with our approach to understanding systems. So this is my current thinking about how to make sense about this. So this approach that I described earlier with the system build, I think it will work in the complex zone. I think I've used the terminology hold it loosely. You need to be able to focus on the experiment part, which is working in the system, thinking about multiple experiments you want to try because you're not quite sure what will or won't work. You're still trying to figure out, cause and effect relationships. I think the approach does work if you've moved into the complicated zone. You're pretty confident that you can understand cause and effect. You're just trying to use it to drive some of those behaviors and those results that you want to see. And I think it does work if you want to move things into the obvious domain. You want to create some standard work. But again, I give the caution, you want to avoid over-constraining. Be prepared to study and adjust that system to adjust accordingly to any changes in the context. And I think it even might work if you take a shallow dive into the chaotic zone. But for this, I would say you want to hold it very loosely, because any constraint, even a constraint of a way of thinking about what the purpose is or what will or won't work, could be a limitation. And I think that you want to free up the constraints as much as possible. So I think further experimentation around how this would work in innovation is certainly something to explore. We've used this approach, the system build, with many organizations. Folks on the call or that are viewing the recording might see their logo represented here, and if I've missed somebody, I apologize. We know we've introduced this to a lot of different organizations that are finding benefit to using this approach. I strongly encourage people to visit the Cognitive Edge website, and there's great resources here. I'm a regular viewer of Dave Snowden's blogs. I've attended a couple of the training and education that they've offered, and they're doing some really cool things related to what they call SenseMaker, which I think people would benefit from greatly. So I strongly recommend that people would avail themselves to really learning more about that. Studying complexity science is going to be very important. So I want to unmute the phone, and I've covered a lot of different territory here, but I wanted to see if has this prompted any questions, or people that have been using the methodology, do you have any perspective to add? So I've unmuted the phones to see if there's any comments or question.
Mike, it's Jeff Hunter.
Yes.
In the last year, we've been experimenting with this and practicing with this. What have you learned what's been your biggest learning about what you do when you walk into an organization that is relatively new to wanting to adopt or kind of transform itself from the old way of thinking to the new way of thinking? If that's not too nebulous a question. I mean,
yeah.
You've been going into these organizations for a long time, trying to figure out where to start that's most effective. And so in the last year, what have you learned that's impacted you?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jeff. I appreciate that. A couple things come to mind. One is that everyone is trying different ways to get better. And a common way for them to begin learning about this is through tools and methods. So I don't try to discourage that. I just try to understand that's their starting point. And I try to help them understand what else is possible beyond the application of tools. And I don't want people to think that tools are wrong, that they can have a place, and they do have a place, but they have to understand, or I encourage them to think about understanding what are the principles that are behind the tools and what are they really trying to do to create a sustainable culture of continuous improvement. And I guess finally, related to thinking about the Cynefin model, it's got me thinking more and more about, in the course of a day, people might find the situation that they're in has shifted already. They may have started in chaos, they may have thought it was complicated, and then suddenly it moved into complex. A teacher in a classroom, she has situations where chaos is ensuing, so she has to act, or he has to act. Teaching kids and understanding how do you help kids learn is a complex endeavor, and what works for one kid is not going to work for another kid. But there are some things that can be moved into more of a standard, structured way of doing things, and we need to know when those situations arise. It's. I don't think we learn to think systemically too well in our upbringing, and I think we need to think about that more. So those are some of my thoughts, but I appreciate your thoughts or any thoughts from anyone else on the webinar.
It looked like from the approach you were presenting when you go in and help organizations, I was getting the impression you were using kind of a model cell approach, or let's start small and
Yeah.
try this. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's a common, call it a heuristic or a rule of thumb, and I'll often encourage people to think about simple experiments they can try now and see how those experiments go and contain working in a few areas with people that are willing to try, as opposed to thinking about something that must be templated and expanded across the organization in a rigorous way. And so it's much about simple experiments we can try every day and learn from those experiments, and then expanding as you go.
Thank you.
It's a good point. That's what I'm thinking about.
Thanks.
Anyone
Hey,
else?
Mike, this is Garrett.
Hey, Garrett.
Hey, you've talked about this in the reference of the entire systems design process. I've been kind of going back and forth on the behaviors, and I'm assuming this would apply to specific behaviors identified in the system design as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, if I've got a, I'm going to go back to the system build picture here. So I've got some sort of a system that I'm trying to nurture or design. Can you think of a system in your mind that you're thinking about? An example?
Well, we're working on ideas.
So if you want to have people sharing ideas, right? How do we generate and share ideas?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I thought about this, I would say, is there one area, one department would be my experiment zone, and then I would walk people through and say, so what would be the purpose of having a routine of every one every day or as often as possible generating and testing ideas? So I'll often substitute the word system with routine and say, when we have a routine, when we're doing it on a regular basis and it becomes just a habit about the way we do things, what would be the purpose? Why would we want to have some sort of a routine that generates those ideas? And then I move to a conversation about what kind of principles do I need to keep in mind when I'm designing this system. And I might do some introduction to the guiding principles, but I'm trying to think about what principles would be helpful. Is it respect every individual? Is it, why would we think about that? Would we seek perfection? But then I want to move to the question you asked, which is, so what behaviors would I like to see showing up? And when I think about the key roles, I want to make sure that if I'm working in a department, there's a manager of that department, there's a staff in the department, but there's also a leader that the manager reports to. And so I want to think about, this system's got to drive behaviors that the key players, the leader's got a role, the manager has a role, and the frontline staff have got a role relative to idea sharing. So I generate a few, not a lot, but say, what would I see leaders doing? What would I see manager doing? What would I see the frontline doing? And I list those out. And then I talk about, so outcomes, what do I get more of, less of, if I've got a good idea sharing system? And I think about high level. So I do all that pre-work. And again, going back to behaviors, is I get clear on what behaviors are what I like to see. And I involve the people that are doing that in that discussion. So I involve the leaders, I involve the managers, I involve the front line, and help them to articulate what kind of behaviors do we want to see showing up. Then I get into experimentation, and I may, start with what kind of process do we need that we want to experiment with? What are the key tools? What kind of triggers would we like to have? How would we measure the health of this process that we're trying to develop? And then how often are we going to renew this experiment? So I might do that, but I do that pre-work and hone in on those behaviors because I want to have this be something that is going to help them to deliver not just we get more ideas, but ideas for what purpose, and really trying to create a habit where people are doing more than just doing the work. They're trying to continuously improve the work. I don't know if that's hitting the answer to your question, but that's how I approach it. Does that make sense?
I think going beyond that, so going back to the other framework you showed, that we need to be careful not to be under prescriptive or over prescriptive, and those may change throughout the process, right?
Right.
If you get to the point where you're complacent.
Yeah. Well, my initial work with experimenting, let's say I have a couple of departments that I'm trying to share idea sharing. And so there's a couple, Department A and Department B are going to do some safe to fail experiments. And I might use that approach to help them to design that. And I'm just going to encourage everyday experimentation on that to see if something gets more stabilized over here and said, yeah, it seems to be a pretty good stable system. We're starting to see behaviors. We're starting to see people, they're doing idea sharing even when the manager's not there, and we're not depending upon the leader to be, badgering them. So I've moved from the complex into complicated. I'm still understanding what helps people to generate and share ideas. I want to be careful so that I don't move it too quickly down into the obvious zone where I say, this is now the way we're going to do problem solving. And then I run the risk of forcing something onto people when they're not ready to buy into it. And if it worked in 2 departments, I can't be so sure that it's going to work in the other 10 departments that I'm also hoping to spread it. So it's not just a matter of developing something in a few departments and then, putting together a training program and say, these 2 departments have come up with the way that we're going to do problem solving in this entire organization, because that really treats something that's complex as if it was simple. So that's how I think about that.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay. Well, thanks for your questions. I appreciate that. So what happens next? This recording goes into the website, so you can go to our website and find it there. I'll be sending out to people that participated as well as people on the distribution list. If you live in the Rochester, Minnesota area and you want to participate in one of these workshops, I'll be doing one on Tuesday, January the 15th. So there's that information found at that bit.ly link. Later in January, Tim Petrie is going to give a webinar on a presentation called Functional Management. The organization is patient. You can find the information at that bit.ly link. I've seen Tim's presentation on this in a similar format. He shared a recording with it, and it's really cool, and I think you'll like it. Friend Jason Ewing is going to share thoughts from the standpoint of information technology, a presentation on February the 1st. We are hoarders of technology. Jason works in healthcare, but I think this will also be pertinent for people that don't work in healthcare. We all depend upon healthcare performing well, but I think he's going to have advice for non-healthcare organizations as well. Jumping to May, Didier Rubino works at Fairview Health Services here in the Twin Cities area, based out of St. Paul, is going to be talking about frontline leader standard work and sharing his thoughts in the guidance that he gives organizations around what does that mean as far as the leader standard work for frontline staff. And I've got several topics in the works, following up with some folks from Winona Health that wanted to share some of their thoughts. Ann and Lou Fries gave a presentation in 2017 about natural leadership, and they've written a book called Align, and they want to share some of their current thinking. Angela Swenson has talked about doing a webinar and is open to participating and collaborating with others who would like to do this with her on lessons and learning of a sensei. Plan to have further discussion and examples of leader standard work. Kevin McNamara from Tidy Products shared with me some of his current thinking and work on leader standard work, and he is going to be giving a webinar. We don't have a date for that yet. Designing and adjusting leader standard work, the personal management system. What I would like to do is use the system build approach to take through at least a quarterly discussion about how experimentation on personal leader standard work could be supported using that system build framework. And then more deep dives in understanding, connecting to complexity science and the Cynefin Sense-Making Framework. We've updated our white papers, and we have a new white paper that's available. The Pracademics Guide to Strategy Deployment. If you go to those web pages, you can get them. You can go directly and get it through those bit.ly links. It's also updated some of our other white papers, because every white paper is connected to the other white papers, so we want to keep those in mind. And again, those are those white papers. Another way to get to our white papers is go to this publication page, and you can see these. So in addition to the white paper, there's some other documents that we've published here, some related to Deming Institute presentations, and one going back to with a paper that my son and I wrote when he was in grade school about what grades mean, connecting it to the red bead factory, one of the webinars that Mark Graben and I did on understanding variation in the red bead factory. So I mentioned a future webinar. I'd also like to develop this idea of leader standard work or personal management system into a future white paper topic. And I'm always interested in reaching out to others who would like to participate in co-authoring a white paper on that topic as well. And last point here, anyone who has any ideas or stories they'd like to share, lessons they've learned, or things they're curious about, shoot me an email and we'll feature it for a webinar in 2019 or beyond. So I appreciate everyone's time today. Hope everyone has a good day and a good weekend. Holidays are coming up, so if you're traveling, travel safe. Thanks again, folks.